In 1914, Europe projected an image of immense wealth and absolute control. Millions around the globe lived under the rule of massive, ancient empires that appeared invincible. But underneath that prosperous surface, those same nations were locked in a fierce, aggressive competition, racing to build massive standing armies, claim overseas colonies, and dominate industrial production at the direct expense of their neighbors. This map highlights how the continent divided itself. Two massive alliance camps emerged: Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy on one side, and Britain, France, and Russia on the other. They bound themselves together with secret agreements, functioning like rigid tripwires. Because of these treaties, no single dispute could remain localized. If any one of these nations went to war, the agreements dictated that all the others had to mobilize, guaranteeing a continent-wide chain reaction. That system was finally tested on June 28, 1914. An assassin named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Watching the map, you track the diplomatic cascade happening in weeks. Austria retaliated against Serbia. That prompted Russia to mobilize. Germany immediately backed Austria, while France and Britain prepared to support Russia. The millions of soldiers marching off to battle in August 1914 were highly optimistic. They expected a swift, decisive campaign, with many genuinely believing they would return home before the end of the year. Europe did not accidentally stumble into a catastrophe. A single murder in the Balkans activated a massive geopolitical architecture that performed exactly as it was designed to. To avoid fighting a war on 2 fronts simultaneously, Germany executed the Schlieffen Plan. Their strategy was to bypass heavily defended borders, push rapidly through neutral Belgium, and swiftly crush France before turning east to deal with Russia. When that rapid advance bogged down, both sides dug into the earth to protect themselves. Within a few months, massive, unmoving networks of trenches stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the continent. Inside those trenches, soldiers faced awful conditions. They lived knee-deep in freezing mud, stagnant water, battling disease, exploding rat populations, and brutal winter weather. Military commanders repeatedly ordered men to charge across open ground, relying on older infantry tactics. But those soldiers were running directly into highly advanced defensive technologies: heavy artillery barrages, creeping poison gas, and rapid-fire machine guns. The devastating result of this mismatch is clearly illustrated by the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where the British Army alone suffered roughly 57,000 casualties trying to capture a few yards of land. Heavy industry had replaced strategic maneuverability. Factories mass-produced the weapons, and the front lines operated as a static, highly efficient machine designed for human slaughter. Because the armies couldn't secure a victory on the battlefield, governments had to extract every available resource from their civilian populations. Entire national economies reorganized themselves solely around military survival. With millions of men drafted to the front lines, massive societal shifts took place at home. Women entered heavy manufacturing in huge numbers, staffing the immense factory floors required to produce endless quantities of artillery shells. The prolonged strain broke people, mentally and physically. Returning soldiers suffered from severe psychological trauma, known then as shell shock, while sweeping naval blockades left families back home literally starving in the streets. Facing domestic collapse, Germany took desperate measures to cut off Allied supply lines. They launched submarine attacks on merchant ships in the Atlantic and sent a secret message to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the United States. Those aggressive maneuvers backfired. They pushed public anger to a boiling point, pulling the United States into the conflict in 1917 and flooding the exhausted Allied lines with heavily equipped, fresh American troops. By 1918, the German war machine simply gave out. In a total war, a nation doesn't win through a single brilliant battlefield maneuver. It wins by managing to survive just slightly longer than its enemy's economy. The fighting finally stopped on November 11, 1918. But the joy of Armistice Day stood in sharp contrast to the massive human toll. Roughly 20 million people were dead, and millions more were permanently disabled. Looking at this map of post-war Europe and the Middle East, you can see the absolute eradication of the old world order. The massive borders of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires splintered apart into dozens of smaller, highly unstable nations. The diplomats who gathered to draft the Treaty of Versailles attempted to rebuild the continent. However, they structured the peace by placing the entire blame for the war onto Germany, imposing absolutely crushing financial reparations. The financial strain devastated the German economy. Millions of ordinary citizens lost their life savings to hyperinflation, breeding a deep-seated culture of resentment and national humiliation. That specific burning anger proved highly useful to radical political groups. It provided exactly the kind of populist fuel needed to accelerate the rise of an extreme nationalist named Adolf Hitler. The treaty signed in 1919 did not fix the fractured geopolitical system that caused the conflict. Instead, they weaponized the continent's collective trauma, perfectly setting the stage for an even deadlier global collapse just 2 decades later.